go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. This is the Texas Association Museum's first webinar of 2019, Rethinking Collection Needs in a Digital World. The Texas Association of Museums webinars highlight what's happening inside and around the TAM community. This program lets you hear about what is top of mind at peer institutions and beyond. TAM's mission is to strengthen the Texas museum community through collaborations, connections, professional development, and advocacy. Learn more about TAM membership if you're not a member at www.texasmuseums.org. As I mentioned, this is our first webinar of 2019, and then this program will explore what will certainly be a growing collections conundrum. That's rethinking collection needs in a digital world. I'm your host, Alex Freeman, TAM's Executive Director, and I'm joined today by Ruth Ann Rugg, Director of Special Projects here at TAM, and Robert Friedman, Executive Director of the Permanent Legacy Foundation. Over the next hour or so, we're going to learn about how a Houston organization rethought the notion of permanence in an online rather than physical space, and the implications for the greater museum cultural archival community as these collections are containing increasingly digital or BornDigital artifacts. Before we learn a little bit more about our speakers today, some housekeeping, of course. During the program, you may put your questions into the Q&A box if you are at your computer, and I'll work to weave them in during the conversation if it's pertinent to that particular moment. Or, we'll, of course, we will save some time at the end so that we can answer your questions, because this is a topic where there is a lot of questions, and this is not a webinar to walk away with specific 1, 2, 3 steps, but more about this exploration of this topic and how we can start thinking about how we deal with collections in that digital world. On to our two panelists today. An established professional with 3+ decades of leadership and museum experience, Ruth Ann Rugg is well-versed in the challenges museums are facing today. In 2016, she assumed the new role of Director of Special Projects at the TAM before after her tenure as the ED. In this capacity, she works for TAM on focused initiatives such as the Museum United Phase 2 project, TAM's partnership with the Summerlee Foundation to advance the Sustainability Project, and other programs such as the Finding Alternative Futures, which we'll learn about here shortly. Dr. Robert Friedman has over a decade of experience in the nonprofit sector, focused on developing an inclusive and ethical digital community. As the Executive Director of the Permanent Legacy Foundation, Dr. Friedman is building a nonprofit historical trust to guarantee secure digital preservation for all people. Previously, Dr. Friedman led the Mozilla Foundation Internet Health Agenda in Texas, working with the Austin community leaders to advance digital inclusion, internet centralization, open innovation, online privacy and security, and web literacy. Welcome to the program, Ruth Ann and Robert.
Thank you.
All right, so I'll go ahead and turn it over to Ruth Ann to let us know a little bit about how we started thinking about this webinar, and the bridge is the Finding Alternative Futures program. So what is FAF, Ruth Ann?
FAF, Finding Alternative Futures, Sustainability Through Coaching. This is a project that we have just concluded in the Houston area that is helping 11 history organizations find a different way of doing business. One of the requirements for those who wanted to be part of the program was to be open to substantive change, to be able to admit that the way they have been doing business is not going to be sustainable long-term. They will not be able to continue. So what can they do differently to find an alternative future? I have promised Alex that I won't get off on a tangent and tell you all about the project, because it was really, really a great learning experience for us. We learned a lot about how organizations grow or fail to grow. We learned a lot about the importance of your board of directors and them being engaged. We learned about the importance of the community that the museum is located in and how the museum relates to that community. But primarily, we learned about how sustainability is connected to relevance, and that the two are really inseparable, and we can't all say that we enjoy both. So we spent about 15 months with 3 expert coaches who were working with the museums who were part of this, addressing various issues, topics like vision and mission and leadership and governance. One of those things we did not address was collections, because we were about other kinds of change, not collections. But it didn't take very long for us to be with these museums to understand the enormous and sometimes outsized role that collections played in their daily thinking. We had museums who were really bound to their collections. They couldn't think beyond taking care of their collections. Well, we wanted to talk about telling stories. They wanted to talk about collections care. And yet some of these same museums said, oh, we don't collect contemporary times because we don't have room and we can't take care of everything. We don't have all the resources. And occasionally when we would say, well, what about digital materials? Some of them just looked at us. We had some museums who were so concerned that they do the collections in a traditional kind of manner that they couldn't see, shall we say, the forest for the trees. And one of them that I want to talk about today is the Gulf Coast Archives and Museum of GLBT History. Our friends at GCAM spent 10 years worrying about how to become a traditional museum to house their collection. And I got to tell you, they've got an extraordinary collection. I think not all communities did as good a job as Houston in tracking the history, the development, the evolution of this particular community. I saw an exhibit in, I think it was 2016, maybe 2015, that it was extraordinary what they had. They were working with another organization because they didn't have a place. They didn't have a place to do an exhibit or to do anything else. But when I talked to them about how to further their mission, further their story, and engage more of the community, all they could think about was, we're going to have to build a museum because we have to have a place for all the things. Well, through the course of this project, I think they changed their mind about that. What they have said is, we no longer think we need a museum. We think that we partner with other organizations, that we capitalize on a number of collaborations that are available to us in a community like Houston, and we get our collection out in that way. We tell our stories in that way. And as a result, along the way, GCAM partnered with the University of Houston, which digitized their entire archive, the paper archive, the publications, and the remarkable documents that had been saved. They have a huge collection. GCAM has a huge collection of visual materials, mostly photography in mediums. Well, we don't do beta anymore, do we? So they have a lot of things that are really outdated, and they are now working on a grant to the, well, I've lost the name, but one of the large foundation, the Mellon Foundation, which has a program specifically for community archives. And I tell you, before we had our project, our FAF experience together, they would never have understood their importance in the community, never had the confidence to apply for a major grant like that. So they have, they've done a lot of work in organizing the materials, and they're not thinking anymore about how to have it. They're thinking about where to show it. Right now, they are engaged with the Contemporary Art Museum in Houston. Their collections are featured in an exhibit that is on view right now, I think through the end of August. They are entertaining, I promised I wouldn't reveal any secrets, but they are entertaining other kinds of collaborations for this very thing, so that the community can have access to the stories, to the collection, without having to build a museum to store it. So there were many outcomes of this project where museums chose alternative futures. In fact, someday Alex will let me talk about that the whole time, but not today. Today, I just wanted to feature GCAM because of the progress that they made in thinking about how their collection could have actually a greater life than what it has had in storage for the last 10 years in a place that people couldn't get to it. Do you think that gives a pretty good background? Are y'all nodding? Okay, the guys are nodding, so that's pretty good.
Yeah. Thank you, Ruth Ann. And now we can, I know that when we promoted this event, we had a few questions in mind. And so I'm going to let Ruth Ann and Robert kind of have a little back and forth on some of these questions. And while we do that, if you have questions, please add it to our Q&A, or you can put it in the chat as well, and I'll make sure that we have time to answer those. But go ahead and let's get started with some of the questions that we had posed early on when we were promoting this event.
Well, Robert, I think GCAM is typical of museums that they don't necessarily know what technology they need or want, and this is not their field, so they're not even sure what vocabulary to use. So how can we ensure the long-term preservation of our collections? That's a big old softball, but I'll let you take it. Hey, Robert, you're going to need to unmute your little microphone.
Thank you for the reminder. I just was saying thank you, Ruth Ann. Thank you, Alex. And yeah, I agree. It's a huge question. And it's really the genesis of the work we've been doing at the Permanent Legacy Foundation. Is that question on a personal level, when considering our own individual collections, but through the work we've been doing over the last several years to explore the space. One of the things we have discovered is there actually is there are a lot of organizations asking the exact same questions. There's really concern about the preservation of materials for a variety of different reasons: financial sustainability, safety in places where the integrity of a structure, in war-torn places of the world, for example, but also just in the deterioration, the natural deterioration of objects, and obviously digital scanning, whether it's two-dimensional, three-dimensional, the digital preservation of existing historical or contemporary physical materials is presented as the sustainable way forward. One of the most, I think, compelling reasons for why, when we think about it, is the natural, financial, if nothing else, but also space requirements those problems that digital solves. When we think about physical spaces, the cost, the expense of physical space increases with time, whether it's paying rents or paying upkeep of the physical space. The cost of physical increase with time. And so even if you have a healthy endowment today, returning annually what you need to pay your electricity bill, that will not be the case in 10 years. And so all institutions grow their endowments to keep up with the increasing cost of rents or inflation or the like. The amazing thing about digital is you get the opposite, that the cost of digital storage decreases over time, even when taking into account the size of files and whatnot. That storage cost decreases, and so a fixed endowment set aside for a digital collection today can potentially sustain that collection indefinitely. There's still challenges when you look really far into the future. You're looking at economic sustainability, recessions and things that can really hurt an endowment. But digital storage has the inverse association, with time. The cost decreases instead of increasing, and so that's a really interesting fact. However, there's a big challenge. Just digitizing a thing is not, even if the cost of a hard drive decreases over time, where's the stewardship? Where's the technical stewardship of that? And so some folks, they turn to universities and large institutions that can really sustain that technical expertise and absorb those collections. A lot of folks are just using commercial off-the-shelf sort of for-profit cloud services, whether it's Dropbox or Google Drive. Folks are placing their materials there. But those are for-profit industries. And so the question you must ask yourself is, will these companies find a profit incentive in preserving your data? And if that answer is anything but a certain yes, there's a risk there too. There's also a cottage industry, just for folks who are really interested in the digitization piece and have the resources to support it. There's certainly a cottage industry of preservation platforms out there, really compelling archiving software. Groups like Preservica and Archivematica maintain these open source software libraries and provide support at an expense, provide support and technical expertise and hosting for those software packages. So getting it digital is good financial sense, but keeping that digital copy safe and secure still poses quite a few challenges to an organization without that in-house expertise. And that's really what we have seen, whether it's museums or libraries or archives. That's really where we've seen the trend is mass digitization projects, and then a reliance on some of these Preservica-like platforms has been what we've seen in the industry.
Thank you.
Yeah.
When I talk to museum people about their collections and, hey, have you thought about digitizing this? You picture someone clutching an artifact to themselves and saying, no, because it is ours and we want to keep it, and we want to keep it safe, and we want to be able to get to it. Can you talk to us a little bit about access? Some of the things that you were just saying. How do you manage access?
Yeah, that I think that's an ownership or issue, and really a copyright issue and intellectual property issue. And so the managing that access, there's many different levels. If you spin up your own server and host some software like on that server and put your materials on there, and you have the capability to do that, then you have complete control of access. With any other sort of arrangement, you're running into some compromises. Certainly the commercial models tend to be like all or nothing. It's either private, it's yours, it's only your account or the accounts you share it with can see it, or it tends to be very, very public. For example, you might think in your head something like Dropbox, where there's a lot of privacy and management of materials, or something like Twitter, where it's just out there the minute you put it up. So there's certainly direct messaging and those types of things, but in terms of access to materials, the spectrum tends to be kind of all or nothing. And when you work with companies that have that profit incentive over data, maintaining ownership is an issue. A lot of terms of service terminate the user's ownership over materials, or at least terminate exclusive copyright. In terms of service will also mean that, and company practices might mean that metadata that describes the context of that artifact gets locked up in a proprietary system. Can't ever extract the metadata. So that's an access issue when you're not hosting it yourself. And then there's, it's an interesting thing because, and then with university partners and the like, there are a lot of IP barriers. So universities are extremely protective of IP and copyright and ownership of materials. So I understand, and it's a driving factor of our work are folks concerned with their ownership and copyright of materials. Our personal take at the Permanent Legacy Foundation is that we will not take a copyright away from the material's owner. So we'll never take a copyright for any material uploaded unless that material is explicitly released into the public domain at the time of the user's choosing. So folks can choose to publish their materials openly. And that approach isn't actually unprecedented or anything, but it's very practical. And it kind of, there's a lot of precedent for it, certainly in the open source software community. And also in a lot of the photo sharing sites like Flickr and the like. So GitHub, if you're doing like an open source project, will give you a lot of software licensing options. So even though the software is free and open, you can still retain attribution rights to those materials, or you can retain editing rights. And the like goes for platforms like Flickr, who have worked with Creative Commons licenses, for example, to do that. So there's examples out there. There's just no silver bullet or that kind of connects all of those best practices into a single platform. And that's really, when you're talking about ensuring long-term preservation, but also ensuring access. That preservation access balance is the really hard problem that Permanent Legacy is committed to addressing.
Well, my next question, you'll just have to humor me. It's a little simplistic because I think of collections in two ways. I think of the existing collections, things that may have been created a couple hundred years ago, 50 years ago. And then there are other collections. Probably my best example is photography that were born digital. They are part of the digital age. And I know you handle these two things differently. And in preparation for the question I'm going to ask after this one, can you define for us born digital? What kinds of things are that? And give us some examples.
It's one of those things where the more I look, certainly physical artifacts have not gone away. We all wear clothing and sit in chairs and drive cars, and so the physical world is manifest. But so much of how we capture and share information, experience our daily lives, is purely born digital. And when we look at the next generation, and so certainly everyone alive today, but also especially young people who are coming up, their entire lives are digital. So, examples that I like to look at, for example, which I think are compelling, include public figures who, are already or may one day be increasingly important to our historical understanding of the world. Ruth Ann, and when you and I spoke before this webinar, we joked around about Beto O'Rourke as an interesting example of that, not to get political, but just purely as a figure, a young man who really leaned into digital. On our own board, we've got Josh Baer, the founder of Capital Factory in Austin, a man has a very digital existence to the point where he can be found wearing a camera on himself and recording every aspect of his day and saving that out. And one might wonder, someone like Josh, who's hugely influential here in Austin and a growing influence, opened up a Capital Factory in Dallas. You never know where their life trajectories take them. Will Josh be governor of Texas one day? I'm not stumping for him. I'm purely saying it's hard to know. And that's important. It's hard to know the future trajectory of leaders in our communities today who are documenting their lives, which will be of interest in the future, purely digitally. So whether it's, Josh snapping photos of his family on his phone, documenting his work through email, through shared documents online in the cloud, or some of these chatting platforms, or carrying a video camera on himself. When I think about the sort of museum-like stuff too, when I think about what are some really interesting community-based history projects, I think of a nonprofit organization that we work with called E4 Youth, They work with young people of color predominantly in Austin, in the Central Texas area, really, where gentrification has really transformed communities of color and driven folks out of the city, and with them stories and history about the Austin of a century past. And so what they're doing is working with those young people to connect them with elder members of the community and do oral history projects. But these are not oral history projects like we typically see. These are web VR projects. So they capture recorded audio, they take 360 photo and video, and they stitch those things together into online exhibits using web VR, which is a virtual reality framework on the web. And these are young people, high school, college, and a small nonprofit doing really incredible work. And they don't know where to put their stuff. They're certainly not a Smithsonian institution with a digital collections management, department. They're putting those things on Dropbox or on platforms like GitHub, which is not awful, but again, for-profit platforms that don't have preservation baked into their operating structure, revenue model, or mission.
Wow. Okay, so I heard all of that, and what I feel is this overwhelming mountain of material that's rushing towards us.
Yeah.
And
yes.
How yes, you think about just what we as individuals have on our phones. I think about that in terms of an entire culture, an entire community. How do we plan for managing this burden of ingest that is barreling towards us?
Yeah, that's the thing. I think about a place like the Austin. I have a lot of Austin examples. We could shift to Chicago, which was my previous haunt. But in the last few years that I've been living here, I think about a place like the Austin History Center. And they get drop-offs. People clean out their attic, find something really incredible, an old photo that they didn't, they think might say something important about the history of the city and the area, the region. And they drop it off, and it gets sorted through. It's a fairly modest amount of stuff, and it gets stored. And that ingest problem is challenging for a small organization, but it is certainly manageable in the traditional sense. The digital ingest problem. See, the physical materials of the past were generally maintained and culled and kept carefully preserved by caring individuals. Who some folks might sometimes call hoarders. And it's not a lot of people, right? Most people throw things away, and they keep very little. In the digital age, we have all become digital hoarders. We don't throw anything away. Our digital footprints are immense and massive, and the collection the curation problem becomes completely different. And so that's the big hairy problem we're thinking about as well. How do we educate consumers about the implications of their hoarding? How do we educate them about the practices of preservation, which were natural to us in the past, right? Someone once told me that archiving is less about what you keep and more about what you throw away. And I think we're all natural archivists in that way. And we don't do that anymore. So we're thinking about that personally, and it's an issue that's not just a volume problem; it's also an access and security problem in a reverse sort of, meaning that a lot of people encrypt their files behind passwords, encrypt their drives, and then unfortunately expire or pass on before they are able to pass that security information on to someone else. And those drives and that data is lost forever. For-profit platforms don't want to release data because that is the basis of their profit, revenue model. So that, again, mentioned that metadata before, it gets locked up if arrangements are not made in advance to unlock it for folks. So that's a volume problem. It's also a access problem. And that's really what we're thinking about. The way we think about it is that the story really become, and actually, I'll save this anecdote for sort of the end. But that ingest problem for us is really a new way of looking at the responsibility of historical curation. Is that it kind of that curation to some sense begins with creation, or at the time of creation, that we need to somehow reach down further, not just at the point where materials are transferred into our possession by folks who no longer want them or think they're important, but at a moment where the creation of that material, it's unclear whether it's important or not. The ecosystem of cloud storage hasn't really accommodated for that, and so that we're thinking about digital cloud storage in a completely different way, and that's really it. That the responsibility of sort of curation extends down to the moment of creation. And the anecdote I kind of want to share, the one that kind of set a light bulb off in my own mind, is the Diary of Anne Frank. Going back to the Beto O'Rourke, the Josh Baer story, or, and thinking more about someone who never saw fame in her lifetime. It's an interesting question when we imagine how transformative that story has been to our understanding of that very sad moment in our history, and the empathy that it builds in people. Who would have thought Anne Frank was the person who had done that? And if it wasn't for a caretaker who maintained that diary and passed it on, we wouldn't have that story necessarily. But think about the millions of Anne Franks. Think about the potentially millions of Anne Franks who are alive today and whose diaries are on Twitter or on, I guess, TikTok now. It is a really daunting problem, but I actually think there are solutions, and the solutions are about better practices and about looking deeper into to the moment of creation. It's kind of like, we would normally wait 6 years for something to become important and then preserve it then. But now we really have to start looking today at things that might be important, and worry about preserving them today, because otherwise it might get lost, right? Because of these pressures. So I don't know if that made sense, but that's to some extent the answer to the ingest problem, is getting ahead of the problem.
Well, but how do you do that? I mean, how do you leverage digital media and social networks and all of the above to begin to help people see, to curate what they're doing, rather than just capturing a moment here or there, that they're creating history? I mean, we have online with us today a bunch of museum professionals, many great historians who they understand the concept, but I mean, I don't know, how do you do it?
Yeah, if the place I want to go to in answering that question is sort of to share the strategy that we're kind of adopting here. So our proposition is one, we have to build a digital curation platform that allows individual people who are creating content have a place to store it, and we have to, in a place that's as convenient. To some extent, it's really that, traditional museums, libraries, universities, the models that made those organizations sustainable are sound financial practices, sound historical, cultural heritage practices. There's nothing to lose there. Those institutions are key and critical. And in some sense, I guess what I would say is that the most important aspect of what those institutions have brought, in our mind, is, for one, the endowment model, the nonprofit endowment model, and the nonprofit transparency board model. But in the thing that is probably not going to be possible for these institutions to do at a scale that keeps up with the volume of media is also maybe the least compelling part of what they do, which is cleaning up the mess. Interpretation, context, making sense of collections is the big value add. So on the other side, so if we think about the value of museums and nonprofits, we need partners, right? So these institutions need partners in these storage platforms that help reach audiences and make sense of that mess, and clean it up before it ever reaches that museum, using the right practices, right? We don't want to. That's the thing, is we want to pass those archival practices all the way down to the consumer, creating that media. And that's kind of where Permanent is trying to step in, is that we're trying to build that platform that can give, it's a commercially viable platform that gives users the kind of experience they're used to in cloud storage platforms, but with as a nonprofit organization, the historical mandate, or the nonprofit mandate to be a cultural heritage organization and a historical trust. So we take what we know is valuable in the nonprofit space and indispensable, and we marry it to the practices that sort of the commercial platforms are using that make it convenient for users to essentially hoard these things. And the middle layer is how do we improve the practice of cleaning it up and storing it in a way that isn't just a sync of every selfie that you took today. And that's sort of the software layer, the technical layer we're putting into place. And I think that's what Permanent's working on. But basically, to generalize, I think cultural heritage institutions, museums, should be looking for those tech partners. It is daunting to expect every cultural heritage organization to build the in-house talent to do such a thing. And so, we need more partners to step up and say, we have to take a thoughtful approach to capturing individual people's materials. People call it the potential digital dark ages, the loss of digital material of historical value. I'm not sure if we're really headed towards a digital apocalypse where, all of Beto O'Rourke's stuff's gone because Google, shut down or got broken up and they deleted all his stuff. Probably that's not right. Probably already his political activity is in the hands of opposition research firms. So it's I'm sure there's backup copies of that stuff. I think what we're going to potentially miss if we don't find those partners in the tech space is the potential to really transform how we think about history and democratize the idea of permanence, really make permanence available to everybody.
I know we're getting kind of close to time, but I want to give you an opportunity, just in a big picture sort of way, to talk about implications for collections management in the future, specifically collections management in museums.
Yeah, I think it's a good. It's a good question of what that future. It's hard to predict that future. Museums have been such a stable institution for so long. A decade ago, when I was at the Adler, the big question was, the big tension I was feeling in Chicago was between museum as attraction, theme park, versus museum as, academic hall of knowledge. And traditionally it had been more of, well, one might argue, right? Whether it was always traditionally one thing or the other. And I think there's maybe always been a creative tension in the museum community. Looking forward, I think the tension is going to be what is a museum, and is a museum a physical entity? You get a lot of, I think I always laugh a little bit at the, like, your digital library, like on iTunes, because we know museums are more than just museums, libraries are more than just a list of files that you've got, and a way of searching them. It's a practice. It is a responsibility. And so the question, when I say things like what does a museum look like in the future, I really mean, I made that pithy comment about, not pithy, but I'm just saying it's one of those nice sounding tweet length bullet point ideas of extending the responsibility of curation down to creation. That concept. That's kind of the thing I'm talking about when I'm thinking about, like, what's the future of the museum. I'm thinking about, like, what's the future of the responsibility, and what's the future of where people are going to go to access information from that community. Wikipedia, for example, is a very interesting, I guess they fashion themselves after an encyclopedia. It is a museum of sorts. It is a library of sorts. It has a completely different set of rules and interaction mechanisms and interpretation sort of practices. And there are curators on Wikipedia, and it takes quite a bit of effort to become one. And you have to be a trusted member of that community. So there are rules about that too. And what does it mean for a natural history museum or a small, in a large city or a small town history organization? I live in Bastrop, and there's a small museum in downtown Bastrop, and of, for sure digital, is in the future of curation. There's just no doubt about that. But there's a second question of, is digital asset management future for curate? Meaning, are you responsible for that hard drive and that server and that software at your museum site? Or are you using another backend? Are you partnering with a permanent legacy foundation to create a digital collection which you own and which you exhibit at your space, and you have staff to help people interpret that digital collection? And when I talk about curation responsibilities extending to creation, is that practical for small historical institutions in small towns? Probably not. So just because what does that mean for a 1 or 2 person staff for a volunteer organization? But for the large institutions, I think it is true, is a reality. So then what's the partnership between those small institutions and those large institutions in those digital platforms? I think for sure, one of the responsibilities for the future and the ways forward is to sort of push and poke those digital platforms for better practices. Just by using them, and by partnering with them, and by engaging with them if we can, advocating for them. We're all part of associations like TAM or larger national associations. Poking the leadership of those associations, Alex, I'm talking about you, to bring on partners in the tech space, and to start to really question what is the sustainable practice. It's a wonderful thing for the Googles of the world to create cultural spaces and cultural heritage spaces on the internet. The question is, are those true to the cultural heritage practices of the traditional cultural, preservation institutions that have sustained those stories and materials for a century or centuries? Can we expect the same for the next century? And we need to interrogate that. I think it's, I don't know, that's going from soup to nuts maybe a little bit. We didn't even talk about the practices of, like, migration and creating redundant copies and format conversion, and there's a lot of other technical stuff. But again, I think if we if we need to release a little bit of that burden of expertise onto partners who can do that at scale, because at the end of the day, the advantage of digital is also scale, and we can't all have that scale in every institution. So partnerships and relationships and associations are key to this. Anyway, that's what I had for that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much.
Okay, looks like we have some questions in the queue. Thank you for re-entering those, because we lost them during our little break. But let's go ahead and let's see if either of you'd like to talk about this. Okay, so within the Q&A, how is this? How is this digital storage carried out practically? Are digital files accessioned or just saved? It's easier to imagine digitizing physical collections than anything else. So how's this carried out practically? Are digital files accessioned or just saved? It's easier to imagine digitizing a physical collection than anything else.
Yeah. So working that problem backwards, working that question backwards. Yeah, for sure. If we're talking about our current collections, they're probably mostly physical. And it's probably a digitization problem today. But in the next 5, 10, 15 years, I think those collections may become increasingly digital as people start donating hard drives instead of family, photos, physical photos or physical materials. In terms of the sort of copyright transfer, ownership, attribution, issues of a session, it's in development. Now is the moment for us to sort of determine the best practices, and that's what we're actively working on, and we're looking for partners to help us do that right. There is no real path forward, meaning there isn't really a good example of someone got this right in the way that we're doing it. For an organization like the Internet Archive, for example, which is probably the closest thing and a mentor for us. If you haven't seen the Internet Archive, go to archive.org. Archive.org is a great that is a guiding star for us, a North Star. But Internet.org is focused on public domain materials. So these are things that are already free and open in the public domain. And when you get them on the archive, they're on the archive. And so, you can upload anything you want. So in that sense, I guess they're mostly saved. But these are good questions. And I don't mean to speak I don't know everything about the archives session structure. So I don't mean to misspeak. I'm just pointing to them as a long-standing partner in this digital partner in this space that has ironed out a lot of this issues in their own way. But we have opportunity to do it in a similar, different way, or a new way entirely.
Okay, and a related question is, as a small museum with limited staff and budget, where do you begin in deciding where to start undertaking a collections digitization project?
Ruth Ann, I wonder if that isn't a good question for you, and part of finding alternative futures work. I'm happy to reflect on it too.
Well, I have to tell you, Alex, you were breaking up. I didn't quite hear the question. I'm sorry.
As a small museum with limited staff and budget, where do you begin deciding where to start in undertaking a collections digitization project?
Well, I think the previous question, yes, it is easier to think about our physical collections. That is why we're having this conversation today, because we want to encourage people to think about their digital, not their physical collections. I suspect everyone has the kind of storage room where there's a little stack in the corner and you're not sure what it is or where it came from, and it's just been there for a long time. It's safe, so you just leave it there. This happens with digital materials as well. So if there is someone who could at least keep track of what you have, whether it is an oral history, whether it is photographs from one of your founders, whatever it is that's digital, just keep a list. I don't think you have to worry about applying the formal protocols of accessioning to this, but I think you do need to keep up with it.
Okay.
And I would say that it's also, they're different. Physical and digital are different, experiences, but it's also a way to extend. So I think personally, if you're asking me, I'd say the most exciting digitization opportunities are the ones in which you are able to digitize materials that you can't otherwise display, that extend the story or extend the experience for users when they get back home or even inside the gallery.
That's a good point, and it kind of relates to this last question we have, the Q&A. We have Jamie is currently undertaking her first internship in a museum, and it's amazing. How would you recommend going about adding a digital component to a small exhibit that doesn't have room for all the artifacts?
Yeah, that's a good interpretation, exhibit design question. And I could put that hat on from my previous experience. Ruth Ann, I want to give you another first swing at it, and then maybe I'll add if there's anything.
Well, I would just ask, is there anything audio that you could add? Is there anything visual that you could add? Is there something where, people come and put the headphones on? Is there something that exists digitally that can be incorporated? Not everything has to be as traditional as we tend to make them in museums. I would think, first of all, back to what is the story you're telling with your exhibit? What is the story? And is there something that could enhance that comes from digital material? It doesn't have to be expensive, and it doesn't have to be fancy.
Yeah, I entirely, that builds entirely on the idea of what's not out there already necessarily on your floor or whatever. And a pair of headphones and a plugged into an MP3 player can be a very exciting, immersive addition. So it doesn't. I agree. I think that was a spot on. I would go to the same place in thinking about it.
Okay, and RG, he said, if a museum decides to go mainly digital, certainly that does not mean that objects being digitized are not going to be discarded or destroyed. Therefore, the objects still need to be stored somewhere and managed just the same as with traditional museum practices. So I guess that's, instead of a question, that's a point as to the challenge that we're facing here now, because of that overlap between the physical and the online space. But what we've been talking about is just the increasing size of the digital stuff. So yeah, we're in this digitization period, but then we're going to be working with digital material. Any thoughts on that, Robert or Ruth Ann?
Well, hi RG. As the solidly museum person in this trio, I feel obligated to say we are not trying to get rid of your physical collections. That is not what this discussion is about. However, you know that it could take the remainder of our lifetimes to get around to digitizing all the physical collections that exist. Meanwhile, there are BornDigital materials that are coming to us all the time, every day. And if they're not coming to you, to your museum, geez, maybe you need to look around and do some soliciting. And the conversation we've had today really, I think, informs that we can't ignore this any longer. We really need to do some preparation.
Okay. Any last words, Robert?
I think there's the digital space is so broad, and one of the things that really struck me in this conversation, prepping for this webinar with y'all, and is the sort of tension between thinking about what we already have versus thinking about what's coming. And museums have such a challenge right now with managing what's already in hand. It's hard to think about the future. And so for those of you brave enough to attempt both, I salute you. And I'm a friend and would love to connect anytime, and really appreciate the opportunity to speak to everyone and share what we've been thinking about and working on as sort of fellow travelers on this journey. So thank you so much for the time, Alex and Ruth Ann.
Okay. Okay, to wrap up today's program, I want to thank Ruth Ann Rugg from TAM and Robert Friedman from Permanent Legacy Foundation. If you have any further questions about what you heard today or want to learn more about TAM membership, please reach out to me at alex@texasmuseums.org. Thank you all for joining me today. We're going to start doing some more webinars over the next, like once a month over the next few months. So keep tuned in to our communications in case any of these are pertinent to you. But thank you for your time, and thank you for hanging in there with us during that little unannounced break towards the end. Thanks again. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.